Thank you very much, Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, members of the committee. I want to begin and embed this in a little bit of the story of understanding what happened and why it matters. In June 2014, NATO foreign ministers met in Brussels to consider Montenegro's accession to NATO. Just 3 months prior, the Russian Federation had annexed Crimea. So many argued at the time that the NATO's decision to invite Montenegro into the alliance was not only merited on its own terms, but would also contribute to a decisive response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Others, however, urged delay, emphasizing de-escalation of the crisis unfolding in Ukraine. In the end, it was ambivalence among key allies and, frankly, opposition by the United States that led the alliance to punt the decision, agreeing to reconsider the issue by the end of 2015, which would be 18 months later. So as NATO ministers failed to reach consensus on Montenegro that tumultuous summer, Moscow saw an opening. NATO had blinked. With the successful seizure of Crimea and the emergence of what the Kremlin believed would become Novorossiya, Russia was on offense, the West was stunned. And true to form, Moscow's success emboldened the Kremlin to pursue further success. The thinking in Moscow was that the seizure of Ukrainian territory would surely block Ukraine's move towards NATO and the EU. But might the Kremlin also be able to stop the integration process in Southeast Europe? So it's during this period that the plot for Montenegro was hatched, when Alexander Sinjulic, the leader of the paramilitary Serbian Wolves, began sending Serbian fighters to fight in Ukraine, himself included. It's there that Russian nationalists introduced him to two Russian military intelligence agents, GRU agents, Edward Shirokov and Vladimir Popov. Open source reporting provides a compelling case that the GRU and its associates were directly involved in orchestrating the attempted coup. Sinjelovic received money from these Russian contacts to purchase weapons and supplies and used in the Montenegro operation and to recruit participants. The details are sensational. And since Senator McCain, you asked, I'll add a few more of the details to put that in the record. We should remember that this was Plan B. Plan A was for the Russians to tip the balance of the elections. I've had the opportunity to travel to Montenegro regularly almost every year for the past several years. And in the run-up to this election, it was pretty remarkable to see street signs, billboards all across the country, anti-NATO campaign. So the plan was to defeat the pro-NATO forces in this election through using the Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, a telecommunications company, and a media empire. This small country of 600,000 was flooded with resources to tip the balance. In fact, the main Serbian opposition party was not radical enough, and the Russians sidelined them, picked a fringe party called the Democratic Front, and through its resources, it went from being irrelevant on the Montenegro political scene to now being the leading opposition. Two of its leaders now are being tried for the coup attempt. That was Plan A. Plan B was that on October 16th, 2016, if the pro-NATO forces were to succeed at the election, to enter Parliament dressed as Montenegro security services, open fire on opposition supporters that the organizers had cynically gathered and called to convene in front of the Parliament themselves, kidnap or assassinate the Prime Minister, declare the elections invalid, and install the Democratic Front taking power. This followed very rapidly by a series of very strange developments. On October 24th, after Serbs doubting it, announced they had found complicit information about co-conspirators in Belgrade. 2 days later, the head of the, Patrushev, the head of the Russian National Security Council, arrives in Belgrade, supposedly privately to apologize for a botched operation, but also to provide cover for the deportation of two Russians that departed Belgrade, some just before and some again on November 11th. December 12th, Lavrov is there seen pictured with one of the co-conspirators in this coup. It is a spy novel. It's hard to believe. If the coup would have succeeded, it would have dealt an immeasurable blow to the alliance. It would have brought a halt to the process of NATO enlargement as well. This incident is part of Russia's strategy to make the world safe for autocracy and kleptocracy. Russia seeks to reverse the Cold War order and undermine both NATO and the EU from within through malign influence operations. In response, the United States and the European Union have enacted tough sanctions, and I very much support the congressional effort to toughen those sanctions with the bill that's pending. But sanctions should be part of a strategy rather than the strategy. This administration has yet to articulate clearly the nature of the Russian challenge, much less the strategy to counter it. Nonetheless, I believe that key elements of a response are in place or within reach. To tackle malign Russian influence, I'd advocate a 5-part strategy: promoting prosperity, bolstering our defense capabilities, pursuing a concerted engagement strategy, exposing Russian actions, and anchoring our actions in our ideals. That is, offering our vision of what it is we are seeking to achieve rather than simply countering Russian moves. Russia is able to advance its malign influence where there is a nexus of corruption, organized crime, and underdevelopment. To tackle this, the head of an allied intelligence service recently told me that prosperity is the best antidote as it increases the resilience of nations, particularly in the Balkans and Southeast and Eastern Europe. I think this is why President Trump's endorsement of the 3 Cs initiative in Warsaw is important. It's an initiative that brings together the 12 EU member states between the Adriatic, the Baltic, and the Black Seas with the aim of advancing cross-border energy, transportation, and telecommunications infrastructure to better integrate their economies, unlock growth potential, and ensure that Russia cannot hold their economies hostage. This is why the congressional move to lift restrictions on LNG exports to Europe is so important as well. So I actually believe an American prosperity agenda should advance U.S. investment in the region, putting economic ties on par with our security ties. It is entrepreneurship, after all, that provides jobs outside the control of political patronage networks, which are subject to Russian manipulation. Second, we need to project our military strength as a stabilizing force. The $4.8 billion European Deterrence Initiative request is a great contribution, especially on the eastern flank. But just as we have positioned modest forces in the east, we should do so in the southeast. This means transforming our forces that are in KFOR, modest as they are at Camp Bondstill, into what I would call a permanent presence to project security throughout the region, and bolstering Black Sea security by approving the pending Patriot sale to Romania and providing lethal assistance, military assistance to Ukraine and Georgia. Third, the United States needs a sustained diplomatic offensive in the region. Our engagement is too episodic and not at a sufficient political level. Vice President Pence will soon visit Tallinn, Podgorica, and Tbilisi, where he can follow up on the 3 Cs prosperity agenda and I hope announce more steps to bolster our security commitments. But even as we work to ensure Montenegro's NATO membership, a success, we should have a diplomatic strategy that pursues a historic rapprochement with Serbia that ends Belgrade's dangerous hedging, which is why President Vucic's visit to Washington next week is so important. The United States should also resume its leadership in resolving the name dispute between Greece and Macedonia, paving the way for the latter's membership in NATO. And to start, we should welcome the Greek Prime Minister to Washington to ensure Athens is as a partner rather than an obstacle in the region, not tempted by Russian manipulation. Fourth, the most effective means to counter Russian malign influence is to expose it. As our electorates become educated on Russian influence operations, they become inoculated to its impact. This is why the Atlantic Council just last week in Warsaw convened the first ever open source summit to train journalists and activists on using unclassified techniques to expose and combat Russian influence. Through this work, we've been able to document in great detail what unfolded in Montenegro in an unclassified setting. We need to empower this type of work across the alliance as it makes our democracies more resilient and our electorates less susceptible to manipulation. But most importantly, I think we need to keep our values as our guiding star and restore a credible vision of a Europe whole and free. Our message should be clear that as a result of reforms at home, all European states can ultimately be part of a secure and prosperous transatlantic community. Advancing a Europe whole and free should be a central plank of a broader effort to rally the West, as President Trump perhaps suggested in his Warsaw speech. I prefer the term free world to connote our community as not one of geography, but one of ideas. Senator McCain, you put it, defense of the free world is the purpose where we try to rally folks around democratic institutions, rule of law, free media. And as part of this strategy, the United States itself must remain a force for integration, not fragmentation in Europe. We cannot be ambivalent about this. We should never become an enabler of the Kremlin strategy to divide and weaken the European Union. Excluding the invasions of Ukraine and Georgia, the coup in Montenegro may be among the most brazen of Russia's influence operations. Its significance is that the Russians almost got away with it. But it is not unique. There are incidents. In October 2014, Russian Cossacks entered Banja Luka, poised to intervene if Milorad Dodik had lost his election. Arms caches have been found in Hungary with ties to GRU agents. Russian fingerprints are on spectacular kidnappings in Estonia, instability and violence in Macedonia, efforts to stoke separatism in Gagauzia and Moldova, and to delegitimize Kosovo as a state on top of the financing of extreme political parties across the continent. The Kremlin has drawn its own lessons from the muted response of the free world. I think it's important that we must end the cycle of impunity, continuing to raise the costs of not only Russia's actions in Ukraine, but also its interference in our democratic societies, even as we work to eliminate the opportunities for its malign influence throughout Europe. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wilson, and thank the witnesses. Let's talk for a minute, Mr. Wilson, about Serbia. There's unique ties between Serbia and Russia. Mr. Vučić seems to be almost schizophrenic. He wants good relations with the United States, yet he also understands the Serbian people's affinity to Russia, yet he also understands the Serbian people's look is to the west, not to the east. As you say, he's coming to town next week. That could be a very seminal event. I had a long lunch with him in Belgrade, and how do you think we should treat Mr. Vučić?
I think this is a strategic opening, and we should play for Serbia, not in a way that I am not unaware of some of the challenges to Serbian democracy internally, but I think we need to recognize that Vučić has been hedging between Russia and Europe and the West, in part because he sees the EU as distant and uncertain in its commitment to Serbia's place in Europe, and the US as an inconsistent and somewhat distant partner. But we have an opportunity right now. This coup, I had the opportunity to meet with President Vučić in Belgrade at the beginning of this year. This coup in Montenegro is a wake-up call not just for us, but for those sitting in Belgrade. It was forces within his intelligence services for which he probably was completely unaware that were complicit in this. Shortly after the exposure of this coup, an arms cache was found in Belgrade on the route that is driven from his family's house. I think this has had a psychological impact. The Serbs believe that they can hedge and play both sides. Most Serbs know the reality is their economy is overwhelmingly anchored in Europe. Their interests are overwhelmingly anchored in Europe. I think with clarity from the United States, coordinated with Germany and the European Union, that we can help Mr. Vučić understand that hedging is actually playing with fire, and that their ability to maneuver this poses actually risk to Serbia and its future over time. One of the challenges we have is that, unfortunately, Serbia allowed the opening of a civilian emergency response base in Niš in southern Serbia, where the Russians have been breathing down his neck to obtain diplomatic immunity for their it's the Ministry of Emergencies. The Ministry of Emergencies has a notorious record of being involved in nefarious activities in this region. And I think part of what our presence can do by transforming our own presence at Bondstill, saying it's a presence for the region, is to help signal to Serbia that we won't be a fair weather friend. This isn't a partisan issue. We can have a consistent American strategy of engagement, supporting their transformation at home and welcoming them in our community.
Ms. Sam.